A scribe sits in a small room in a city on the coast of what is now Syria, and he is pressing wet clay with a sharp reed, writing a letter that will never be sent. The harbor below him is on fire. The ships he is describing, the enemy ships, are already in the water off his city, and the army that was supposed to defend this place is somewhere far to the north, fighting a different war for a different king. He writes that the enemy has burned his towns and done terrible things in his country. He writes that the land is left to itself. He asks for help that is not coming. Then the tablet leaves his hands, and at some point in the next hours or days, the building around him burns, and the fire does a strange thing. It does not destroy the letter. It bakes the soft clay hard, the way a kiln bakes a pot, and it seals those words into the ground for more than 3,000 years. The city is called Ugarit, and it is about to vanish from the earth so completely that when men dig it up again in the 20th century, they will not even be sure at first what they have found. That scribe did not know it, and neither did anyone else. But he was not just watching the end of one city, he was watching the end of a world. Within about 50 years, almost every great kingdom around the eastern Mediterranean would burn, fall silent, or simply cease to exist, and people have been arguing ever since about why. This is the story of the late Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the largest and strangest mysteries in all of human history, because it is a mystery about an entire civilization, not a single ship or a single person. Around the year 1200 before Christ, the lands that ring the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea were home to a connected, sophisticated, almost modern web of powers. There was Egypt at the height of its new kingdom, the Egypt of giant temples and god-kings. There was the Hittite Empire, a superpower spread across what is now Turkey, with a capital so large it had walls miles long. There was Mycenaean Greece, the world of Homer's heroes, of gold masks and stone fortresses. There were the great trading cities of the Levant, like Ugarit, and the rich copper island of Cyprus. These were not isolated tribes. They traded with each other, wrote letters to each other, married into each other's royal families, fought each other, and depended on each other. And then, in the span of about 2 generations, the whole thing came apart. Cities were burned and never rebuilt. Trade routes that had run for centuries went dead. In Greece, people forgot how to write. The question that has haunted historians for more than 100 years is simple to ask and brutally hard to answer. What could possibly knock down every great power in a region at the same time? And the honest answer is that no single thing did it. That is the whole secret, and it is also the whole problem. To feel the weight of what was lost, you have to understand how connected this world really was, because that connection is the thing most people get wrong about the ancient past. We tend to imagine these old kingdoms as separate and primitive, walled off from one another, each minding its own affairs. The truth is closer to the opposite. By the 14th century before Christ, the great kings of Egypt, Babylon, the Hittites, and the kingdom of Mitanni were writing to each other constantly, in a kind of diplomatic club, exchanging gifts and brides and complaints. We know this because a cache of their letters survived in Egypt, baked clay tablets written in the language of diplomacy of the day, and in them you can hear kings haggling over gold, scolding each other for slow shipments, asking after each other's health. They called one another brother. This was an international system with embassies and treaties and trade law 3,000 years before anything we would recognize as the modern world. And the engine that drove all of it was a metal that none of them could make on their own. The age is called the Bronze Age for a reason. Bronze was everything. It was the swords and the spear points and the armor, the tools that cut the grain and the wood, the fittings on the chariots that won the wars. Without bronze, a kingdom was helpless. But bronze is not one metal. It is a recipe, mostly copper, with a smaller amount of tin mixed in, and there is the trap. Copper they could find. Cyprus was practically built on it. Tin was the problem. Tin was rare, and the nearest large sources were far away, hundreds and even thousands of miles from the Mediterranean, in places like the mountains of Central Asia. To make the bronze that held their whole civilization together, these kingdoms needed a supply line that stretched across the known world. And that supply line had to keep running, year after year, or everything stopped. There is a shipwreck that shows you exactly what this looked like, sitting on the seabed off the southern coast of Turkey, near a point called Uluburun. A small trading ship went down there around 1300 before Christ, and when divers finally explored it in modern times, they found a cargo that reads like an inventory of the entire age. 10 tons of copper, cast into flat ingots, shaped a bit like an ox hide so men could carry them on their shoulders. About a ton of tin, the exact ratio you would need to turn that copper into bronze. Hundreds of discs of raw colored glass, logs of fragrant wood, jars of resin, elephant ivory, and a hippopotamus tooth, ostrich eggshells, gold and silver, beads, weapons, and ordinary cups and pots from a half-dozen different lands. Scholars who studied the wreck concluded that its goods came from at least 7 distinct cultures: Egyptian and Cypriot and Canaanite and Mycenaean and more, all riding in the belly of one ship. The tin, when they tested it, had come from sources as far away as Central Asia. One ordinary merchant vessel, carrying enough metal to arm a small force, knitting together half a continent. That is the world we are talking about. Rich, busy, connected, and, though no one could see it yet, balanced on a very thin support. Now hold that picture in your mind, the letters between brother kings, the ship full of treasure from 7 lands, and watch what happens to it. Because somewhere around the year 1200 before Christ, the lights start going out, one by one, and the order in which they go is part of the puzzle. Start in Greece, with the people we call the Mycenaeans. These were the Greeks of legend, the ones later poets would remember as the army that sailed to Troy. They built fortresses with walls of stone so massive that later Greeks could not believe human beings had stacked them and decided giants must have done it. They were rich. They were organized. And in the decades right before the collapse, you can see them growing afraid. The great palaces of Mycenae, of Tiryns, of Pylos went into a kind of defensive crouch, strengthening their walls, in at least one case digging a secret protected passage down to a hidden water supply, the sort of thing you only do when you expect a siege. And then there are the writing tablets. The Mycenaeans kept careful records in an early form of Greek, scratched into clay, mostly dull lists of sheep and oil and bronze. But at the palace of Pylos, in the last records before the end, the lists change. They start tracking men posted as watchers along the coast, guarding the shore, and the assignment of rowers, as if the people in that palace were staring out to sea and waiting for something to come. We know they were right to be afraid, because Pylos burned. The fire that destroyed it baked those very tablets hard, the same accident that saved the letter at Ugarit, which is the only reason we can read the last anxious words of a doomed administration today. One by one, the Mycenaean palaces fell, and they did not come back. The kings vanished, the writing stopped, and Greece slid into a dark age so deep that the Greeks themselves forgot they had ever known how to write at all. When literacy returned, centuries later, it came in a completely different alphabet, and the old script had to be deciphered from scratch in the 20th century like a code from a lost planet. Move east to the Hittite Empire, the great land power of the age, and the picture gets worse, because here we have something we almost never have from the ancient world. We can hear them starving. In the final decades of the empire, the letters that survive are full of hunger. The Hittite heartland in central Anatolia depended on grain, and the grain was failing. A Hittite king wrote to the ruler of Ugarit, demanding a ship and crew to carry a huge load of grain, something on the order of 450 tons, and the letter ends by saying, in plain words, that it is a matter of life and death. Think about that. A superpower, the equal of Egypt, reduced to begging a coastal trading city for food and telling them not to delay the ship. Even Egypt got involved. An earlier pharaoh recorded that he had sent grain in ships to keep the land of the Hittites alive, an act of famine relief between rival great powers more than 3,000 years ago. None of it was enough. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, a city of perhaps tens of thousands behind those enormous walls, came to an end around 1200 before Christ. And here, the archaeology adds a chilling detail. The city does not look like it was simply overrun by a screaming horde. Large parts of it appear to have been abandoned in an orderly way first. The royal family seems to have left. Records were stored away, valuables removed, the grand buildings emptied, and only then was the place burned. The capital of an empire was deserted and set alight, and the empire it ruled never reformed. The Hittites, who had once fought Egypt to a standstill, simply disappeared from history. For thousands of years afterward, people doubted they had ever existed at all, except as a strange name in old scripture, until archaeologists dug their cities back out of the Turkish earth. Then there is the coast, the string of wealthy trading cities along the Levant, and the brightest of them was Ugarit, where this story began. Ugarit was a jewel, a cosmopolitan port stuffed with palaces and temples and libraries, a place where merchants spoke many tongues and scribes wrote in several scripts, and it produced one of the most haunting documents in all of history, those final letters baked into the ruins. In one, the last king of the city, a young man named Amurapi, answers a desperate plea from the king of Cyprus, and you can feel the floor giving way beneath him. He writes that enemy ships have come, that his cities have been burned, that the enemy has done evil things in his land. He explains, almost in despair, that his own army is far away in the land of the Hittites, and his own fleet is far away off the coast to the west, so that the country is left undefended, abandoned to itself. 7 enemy ships, he says, have already done great harm. Another letter, written from somewhere else, describes the aftermath in a single, devastating line, that when the messenger arrived, the army had been shamed and the city was sacked. Ugarit burned, and like the others, it was never rebuilt. The port that had connected the whole eastern sea fell silent, and the silence lasted forever. And finally, there is Egypt, the one great power that did not fall. And Egypt is the reason we have a name and a face for the danger. Around the year 1177 before Christ, in the 8th year of the reign of a pharaoh named Ramesses III, Egypt fought for its life against an invasion unlike anything in its records. On the walls of his great memorial temple, at a place called Medinet Habu, near the modern city of Luxor, Ramesses left enormous carved scenes and one of the longest inscriptions to survive from the ancient world, and it describes a coalition of peoples coming by land and by sea. The carvings show a fierce battle in the waters of the Nile Delta, Egyptian archers raining arrows into foreign ships. The enemy fleet capsized and the men spilled into the water. The text says that no land could stand before these invaders, that the great powers to the north had already been swept away, that they were cut off in one moment. It even names some of the kingdoms it claims were destroyed, and the list lines up unsettlingly well with the very places we just watched burn. And in among the war scenes there is one image that changes the whole meaning of the thing. Along with the warriors, the carvings show ox carts piled with women and children, slow wooden wagons rolling into the middle of a battle. Those are not the supply train of a raiding party. That is a people on the move, carrying their families with them, looking not for plunder, but for somewhere to live. The Egyptians had a name for the great enemy that came out of the sea, and from their inscriptions, modern historians took a name that has carried a heavy load of mystery ever since. We call them the Sea Peoples, and for a long time, They were the answer, the whole answer. It is easy to see why. The story is clean and dramatic. A mysterious, ferocious confederation of seafaring raiders comes boiling out of the Mediterranean, falls on one rich kingdom after another, burns the cities, scatters the survivors, and only mighty Egypt manages to throw them back, bleeding, at the very gates of the Nile. You have an invasion, a villain, and a clear chain of destruction. The Egyptian carvings seem to lay it all out. The burned cities seem to confirm it. For generations, this is the picture that hung in the public mind, and it is still the version most people half remember if they have heard of any of this at all. So let us take it seriously, because it is not foolish. It is just not the whole truth. The case for the Sea Peoples as the cause of the collapse rests on real evidence, and it deserves a fair hearing. We have an actual pharaoh, in an actual inscription, describing an actual war against an actual coalition that he says had already destroyed the great northern kingdoms. We have the letters from Ugarit, written by a king watching enemy ships burn his coast in real time, naming the threat as it killed him. We have the watchers posted on the coast at Pylos, men staring at the sea in fear. We have layer after layer of burned destruction across the whole region, dozens of sites, many of them ending in fire at roughly the same time. If you are looking for a smoking weapon, the carvings at Medinet Habu and the last gasp from Ugarit are about as close as the ancient world will ever hand you. Something violent and human came across that sea, and it killed cities. That much is not really in doubt. But the moment you press on the theory, it begins to bend, and the cracks tell you something important. Start with the simplest question. Who were they? The honest answer is that we are not sure. The Egyptian texts name several groups within the coalition, but the names are slippery, and scholars still argue over which corner of the Mediterranean each one came from. There is no homeland on a map you can point to and say, here, this is where the storm began. They are defined almost entirely by what the Egyptians said about them, which is a little like trying to know a people only through the war propaganda of their enemy. And that leads to the deeper trouble. The Egyptian account is not a neutral report. It is a monument built to glorify a pharaoh, carved on the wall of his own memorial temple, designed to show him as the divine champion who saved the world from chaos. Kings in that age routinely exaggerated their victories, and even copied old battle scenes from earlier reigns. So when Ramesses says no land could stand before the enemy, we have to ask how much is history and how much is a god-king polishing his legend. Here is the problem that finally breaks the simple story. Those ox carts full of women and children, a raiding fleet looking for treasure, does not bring its toddlers along. People who pack their families into wagons and push into a war zone are not attacking for sport. They are fleeing something. They are migrants, refugees, whole communities pried loose from wherever they used to live and shoved out onto the roads and the water in search of food and safety, which raises the question that turns the entire mystery inside out. If the Sea Peoples were themselves running from a catastrophe, then they are not the cause of the collapse. They are a symptom of it. They are what the catastrophe looks like once it has already started. Desperate people on the move, washing up on richer shores and breaking them in the process. And that forces us to go looking for whatever it was that drove them out of their own homes in the first place. The villain has become a victim, and the search starts over. So if a wave of raiders is only part of the story, what set the whole region on the road in the first place? Here is where the second great theory comes in, and it is one that feels uncomfortably modern. The sky failed. The rains stopped. A long, grinding drought settled over the eastern Mediterranean right at the turn of the 12th century before Christ, and it strangled these civilizations slowly, from the soil up. This is not a guess pulled from thin air. The evidence comes from the ground itself, read by scientists rather than historians. Researchers have drilled long cores out of the bottoms of ancient lakes and lagoons across the region. and trapped in the layers of mud is pollen, the dust of long-dead plants, settled year by year, like the pages of a book. By counting which plants were growing when, you can reconstruct the climate. And the pollen tells a hard story. Right around the time the cities burned, the plants that need water give way to the plants that survive on little, the signature of a land drying out. Several studies, drawing on cores from places near the coast of the Levant and from the island of Cyprus, point to a serious dry spell beginning at the end of the Bronze Age, one that some researchers argue settled in and lasted, on and off, for as long as 3 centuries. Other scientists have read the same drought in the rings of ancient trees from the heart of Anatolia, where narrow rings mark years the rain did not come. Different methods, different places, pointing the same way. The climate turned against them. And once you accept the drought, the human evidence we already saw suddenly fits like a key in a lock. The starving letters of the Hittites stop being a local misfortune and become exactly what you would expect if the grain belt of Anatolia had dried up. The pharaoh shipping grain to keep the Hittites alive, the desperate demand for 450 tons of food, the line that says it is a matter of life and death. All of it reads like the diary of a famine. The drought theory has a terrible elegance. It does not need a villain. It does not need a conspiracy or an invasion. It just needs the rain to fail for a generation, and everything else follows. Crops die. Granaries empty. Hungry people stop obeying kings who cannot feed them. Some of them pick up whatever they own, load the carts, and head for anywhere that still has bread. And now you have your sea peoples, your migrations, your pressure on the surviving cities. The climate did not have to swing a sword, it only had to close the sky and let hunger do the rest. Still, drought alone does not quite finish the job, and good historians are careful here, because it is tempting to let one tidy explanation swallow everything. Civilizations have survived terrible droughts before and since. A bad stretch of dry years is a disaster, but it is the kind of disaster a strong, well-run kingdom can sometimes ride out, with stored grain, with trade, with sheer stubbornness. Drought sets the stage. It weakens, it frightens, it starves. But to bring down every great power at once, you may need the ground itself to betray them. And that is the third theory. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a violent patch of the planet, where great plates of the Earth's crust grind against each other, and it has always been earthquake country. And when archaeologists examine the ruins of the cities that fell, some of them show the unmistakable fingerprints of a quake. Walls toppled in a particular direction, as if shoved by a single great hand. Columns fallen in a row, bodies found crushed beneath collapsed buildings, people caught where they stood, the way you only find them after a building comes down without warning. These are not the marks of a fire or a sack. They are the marks of the earth heaving. 2 scientists studying this proposed that the region was hit not by a single quake, but by a cluster of them. A run of major earthquakes spread across roughly the 50 years on either side of 1200 before Christ, what they called an earthquake storm. Faults that are linked can set each other off over decades, one rupture loading stress onto the next, and the result can be a generation of repeated, devastating shocks across a wide area. You can see how this becomes the third leg of a stool. Picture a city already half-starved by drought, its trade already faltering, its rulers already shaky. Now the ground convulses. The walls that kept the enemy out come down. The granaries crack. The palace, the temple, the storehouses, the symbols and machinery of order lie in rubble. The survivors are hungry, homeless, and afraid. The government is buried under its own buildings, and into that ruin comes a band of armed and desperate migrants who a year earlier the city walls would have turned away with ease. An earthquake by itself rarely ends a civilization. People rebuild. But an earthquake on top of a famine, on top of a wave of invasion, on top of a system that was already straining, may not give them the chance. Which brings us to the deepest theory of all. and the one that ties the others together, because the more you look at this collapse, the more you suspect that the real killer was not any single blow, but the way these kingdoms were built. They were too connected. They were, in a word that historians genuinely use about them, too globalized. Go back to that shipwreck off Uluburun, the copper and the tin and the goods of 7 nations in one hull. That ship was a marvel, but it was also a warning, because it shows how utterly these powers depended on one another. Remember the trap of bronze. To make the metal that armed your soldiers and equipped your farmers, you needed copper from one place and tin from somewhere far away, carried along trade routes that crossed borders and seas and passed through many hands. As long as the whole network hummed, everyone prospered, but a network like that is only as strong as its weakest link. Cut the tin route and the bronze stops, no matter how powerful your king is. Burn the ports, and the grain ships stop sailing, no matter how rich your kingdom. Each of these civilizations had quietly traded away its self-sufficiency for the wealth that connection brought, and so each of them had become dependent on the survival of all the others. They had built a single great machine out of many parts, and they had forgotten, or never knew, how exposed that made them. Historians have a clean and frightening name for what happens to a structure like that. They call it systems collapse. It is the idea that a complex society, with all its specialists and supply lines and layers of administration, can pass a point where it is no longer resilient, where the very complexity that made it strong becomes the thing that makes it brittle. In a system like that, a shock in one place does not stay in one place. It travels. The drought ruins the harvest in one kingdom, so that kingdom can no longer ship grain to its neighbor, so the neighbor starves and its people take to the roads, so the roads and the sea fill with desperate migrants, so trade becomes too dangerous to risk, so the tin stops coming, so the bronze stops, so the armies weaken, so the next city falls more easily, and each failure makes the next one likelier. It is a chain reaction, a cascade, a row of dominoes that each kingdom helped stand up. Pull out enough pieces fast enough, and the whole interlocking structure does not just decline. It comes down all at once, in a heap, in the lifetime of a single generation. And then it cannot easily be rebuilt, because the knowledge and the trade and the trust that held it together are gone with it. So we come back to the question we started with: what killed the Bronze Age world? And the only honest answer, the answer the best modern scholarship has settled on, is that there is no single answer, and that the search for one has always been the mistake. The most influential recent account of all this, by a historian who fixed the year 1177 before Christ in the public mind as a kind of shorthand for the whole disaster, makes exactly this case. It was not the sea peoples alone. It was not the drought alone, or the earthquakes alone, or rebellion or famine or the failure of trade alone. It was all of them, landing close together on a system that had grown too complex and too interdependent to absorb them. A perfect storm, in the truest sense of the phrase. Each blow made the next one heavier. The drought bred the famine bred the migrants became the sea peoples, the earthquakes shattered the defenses, the violence cut the trade, the broken trade strangled the bronze, and a network of mighty kingdoms that had stood for centuries unwound in a few decades, because every thread was tied to every other one. We should be honest that even this is not the final word, because it never is with something this old and this broken. There are pieces still missing. We cannot date everything precisely enough to be certain which city fell first and which fell last, or to prove exactly how one collapse triggered another. We still cannot say for sure who the sea peoples really were, or how much of Ramesses III's great victory was real, and how much was a king carving his own legend in stone. Some scholars still want to push one cause to the front, and the debate is genuinely unsettled at the edges. This is not a case that is closed. It is a case where the smartest thing we can say is that the world was killed by many things at once, and that we are still learning the order in which they struck. But maybe that uncertainty is exactly the part worth carrying away, because it is the part that reaches across 3,000 years and taps you on the shoulder. For a long time, people wanted the Bronze Age collapse to have a simple cause, a single enemy, because a single enemy is comforting. You can name it, blame it, and tell yourself you would have seen it coming. The harder truth is that the most connected, advanced, prosperous world the planet had yet produced did not fall to one great villain. It fell because it had quietly become fragile, because every kingdom had come to depend on every other, because a run of bad years and natural disasters and desperate people hit a system that had no slack left to give. No one of those things should have been fatal. Together, arriving at once, they were. The people living through it almost certainly did not understand what was happening to them while it happened. They only knew that the ships had stopped coming, that the grain was short, that the cities to the north had gone quiet, and then that the smoke was rising from their own. We live in the most connected world there has ever been, far more tangled and dependent than theirs. Our food and our metal and our fuel and our machines all riding the same long supply lines across the same wide seas, every part leaning on every other part. So the next time you hear someone insist that a great and complicated system is too big and too advanced to fail, remember the scribe at Ugarit, pressing a warning into wet clay while the harbor burned, certain that help was on the way, and remember that the letter outlasted the entire world that wrote it. If you want more lost worlds and forgotten warnings brought back to life like this one, subscribe and stay with me, because there are a great many more of them waiting in the dark.